Hello and welcome to more history stuff. Now in my last video I spoke about a new book that's just come out on the reign of Edward I called Edward I, New Interpretations. Here it is again, here it is. Very good book, and I said I wanted to discuss different aspects of this book because it's impossible to cover everything in one video. So I wanted to kick off by talking about the article written by Professor Michael Brown, which is called Hearts and Bodies, Edward I and the Scottish Magnates, 1296 to 1307. Michael Brown is Professor of History at St Andrews, and he's written and published a great deal on the subject of the Scottish Wars of Independence, so he very much knows of what he speaks. And he makes some very interesting and perceptive comments in this article. So the theme is, why does Edward ultimately fail to conquer Scotland, to permanently impose his power on the country, when he's been so successful elsewhere, mainly in Wales? Well, it's a very complicated subject, and it's mainly related to the king's relationship with the nobles of Scotland, the magnates. Anybody who wants to impose a permanent conquest on another country in this period has got to win the support of the nobles of that country. He's got to create a group of magnates who have got vested interests in supporting his regime, and this is what Edward fails to do for various reasons. He first invades Scotland in 1296, and this is initially very successful. He crushes the armed resistance of the Scots in a matter of weeks, occupies the lowlands. It's a very swift, successful campaign, and at this point he does actually have the full support of three very important Scottish noble families. These are the Bruces, the Dunbars and the Stuarts. And there's no doubt that they are fully on board with Edward's ambitions at this point. For instance, when the Scots attack Carlisle in northern England in 1296, the city is defended by Sir William Keith, who is a knight in the service of the Bruces. So the Bruces are actually effectively defending Carlisle on Edward's behalf against the Scots. And they and the Dunbars and the Stuarts also accompany him when he invades the country. So why are they supporting him at this point? Well, of course, they've got their own vested interests and ambitions. The Bruces are hoping that when Edward deposes the Scottish king, John Balliol, that he'll put a Bruce on the throne instead. He'll make a Bruce King of Scots, which he's got no interest in doing, because he's already tried this experiment of ruling Scotland via a puppet king, John Balliol, and it hasn't worked. It's been a disaster, really. So he's got no interest in sort of trying the same thing again. Now it's doubtful whether these three families alone, even though they're quite powerful and wealthy, would have been enough to form a basis of support for Edward's regime, but they could have formed the nucleus of one. If they had supported Edward long term, then it's quite likely that other Scottish noble families would have followed their example. So what Edward really needed to do, after he had conquered, or it looked like he had conquered Scotland in 1296, was to curry favour with these nobles. He needed to really promote them and give them every reason to support him, and pretty much give them anything they wanted. And he's not inclined to do this for several reasons. For a start, it goes against his style of kingship, which has been very successful. There's a lot of discussion about how difficult Edward's last years on the throne are, his last decade, and while that's very true, we probably shouldn't forget that for about 25 years he was an extremely successful king, very capable, very successful, and didn't really fail at anything. So he's got no reason, by the time you get to this late stage of his career, to change what he's doing, especially when it looks like he's won this crushing victory in Scotland. So why should he, suddenly start making concessions and compromises? But that is in fact what he needed to do, and he failed to grasp that. Now the the Bruces and the Stuarts, they turn against Edward relatively quickly. In the case of the Stuarts, this seems to be because their own power in Scotland is actually undermined. Edward puts English lords in charge of territories that the Stuarts had controlled and expected to keep on controlling. He also pardons a lot of Scottish nobles who had fought against him in 1296, and this seems to get up the Stuarts' noses as well. They think that they should be given all kinds of rewards for supporting the king, and that all these guys who fought against him should be punished and imprisoned and disinherited and all that sort of thing. But instead, Edward treats everyone the same. He treats his friends and his enemies in the same way, and the reason he does this is because he immediately wants to use the Scots as a resource of fighting men to help him in Flanders to fight the French. And in 1297, I am consulting this book a lot, so you'll see me looking down at the pages. In 1297, he sends out letters to over 50 Scottish nobles to join the expedition to Flanders. And if the Scots had agreed to this, then he would have been able to take a much bigger army than the one he eventually does take. But for a lot of nobles, this is the last straw, really. They don't want to serve in Flanders. They don't really like this very sort of overbearing, direct form of overlordship that Edward is trying to impose. Things turn sour very quickly. And we pretty much know the result. There's a big revolt against Edward's regime while he's abroad, and this results in the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Although it shouldn't be forgotten that the Scottish nobles don't actually contribute very much to that battle. They actually surrender to Edward's captains at Irvine in July. They prefer to negotiate rather than prolong this resistance. And it falls to William Wallace, of course, and his colleague Andrew Moray, who in terms of social status aren't very important. They're both sort of minor landholders, or gentry as we might call them. And they're the ones who win the battle. The higher nobles, the majority of them, have already thrown in the towel, and Stirling Bridge comes as a great shock to everyone. Not just the English. I think it probably takes a lot of Scottish lords and magnates by surprise as well. They didn't expect that. Nobody saw that coming. And then that is followed by several years of warfare. I mean, Edward comes back, of course. He defeats Wallace at Falkirk, but that doesn't really settle very much. And you have these repeated expeditions and campaigns until you get to 1304. And this is when Edward wins his second military victory in Scotland, when the castle of Stirling, the last Scottish garrison in arms against the king, is taken. That seems to be it. That's the end of effective resistance to Edward in Scotland. And Michael Brown makes this very perceptive remark that in order to achieve a conquest, you need to do two things. You need to win the war first, of course. You need to get the military side of things right, and Edward does that. He's quite good at that. But then you need to achieve a political settlement, which means persuading the people who you want to conquer to accept your regime. And he's not so good at that. Edward isn't great at compromise, although in 1304 he does try his best. You sense that he does really try and make an effort, and he's tried to learn from the mistakes of the past few years. And what he tries to do is conciliate the Scottish nobles who have fought against him, to achieve a sort of reconciliation with them and make them part of his government. He gives them jobs inside his government. This is quite deceptive, of course, because while Edward is he's being relatively sort of nice, the fact is that however many sort of jobs and however conciliatory he is towards the Scots, the reality is that Scotland will now be governed by him. He is the overlord of Scotland in deed as well as in name, and that his men, English lords, will administer the country. And he's letting the Scots sort of help. He's giving them jobs as sheriffs and sort of under administrators and wardens and that sort of thing, but they don't hold the highest posts in this new administration, and it's quite a clever attempt. You can see what Edward is trying to do. So long as he wins the main argument, that everyone agrees that he is the overlord of Scotland, and that's fine. He's happy to sort of relent a little bit otherwise. But this doesn't work either in the long term. Now, why is this? Well, again, he runs up against the same problem. He's got to persuade enough Scottish nobles, especially the really important ones, to support him in the long term. And to begin with, they do. The majority of them swear homage and fealty to Edward at St Andrews in, I think it's February 1304. So they have actually sworn allegiance to him, and unlike in 1296, this time they're not being forced to do it. They swear this oath of their own free will, and this is very important because according to medieval law, if you force someone to swear an oath, then it's not valid, it doesn't have any validity. But if they do it of their own free will, then it's binding. And this is a very serious oath. The Oath of Homage means that you bind yourself as an individual to the monarch. You are his liege man forever, and so are your heirs. And if you break this oath when you've given it freely, then by any legal standards, you're guilty of treason and perjury, and the penalty is fatal. It's death and disinheritance. So that needs to be borne in mind as well when you consider what happens in the next few years. So why do the Scots not accept Edward's second settlement in 1304? Well, there are several reasons again, and it's quite complicated. Edward does make an attempt to be slightly more generous than he has been. He does grant some favours and some lands to some of the nobles who have agreed to swear allegiance to him, and Brown gives some examples. For instance, the Earl of Buchan is allowed a gift of deer and timber to rebuild a damaged manor. Another noble, Gilbert Hay, who is a baron of Perthshire, was forgiven £100 of a relief payment he owed, so long as he conducted himself in a good manner at the king's will, which is quite wonderfully phrased, and basically means so long as he behaves himself and he's a good boy and does whatever Edward tells him to. But otherwise, Edward is more sort of jealous of his rights. He doesn't grant many petitions. He clearly still doesn't trust the nobles very much, and Brown does sort of point out that he's not got much reason to either. Some of them are possibly not the most trustworthy men on the planet. But within about 6 months of the publication of this new settlement, the Ordinance of Scotland as it's called, in mid-1305, the Scots were in revolt again, under Robert the Bruce, of course, who eventually becomes King of Scots and defeats Edward II at Bannockburn. And that's the end, really, of Edward I's efforts to establish his authority. I mean, he lasts another year, which he spends frantically trying to catch Bruce and destroy his supporters, but dies with the situation still very much in flux. And the overall, I mean, there's a lot of detail which I can't go into in a video, but overall the problem is that Edward cannot grasp what he needs to do in Scotland, and the main point is that it's what he needs to do, the kind of compromise that he needs to put into effect, goes entirely against his style of kingship, which has been up until this point very successful. There's a tendency when discussing Edward to focus on the crisis years and the last decade of the reign, which is very difficult, very troubled. But we shouldn't forget that he had been king for about 25 years before this point, and he'd been a major lord in his own right since about 1254. So he's got a very long career in war and politics behind him by the time he switches his attention to Scotland, and he has by and large been very successful. Edward doesn't fail at very much, and Scotland is his only real sort of major failure, and it doesn't rest on any one factor. There's lots of reasons for it, but essentially it's because he cannot create enough support among the Scottish political class. He needed to get enough important men to support him and to give them a stake in his regime. And this ultimately is not the sort of thing that a king like Edward was prepared to do, because that meant making individual families very powerful, and that would of course turn them into a potential threat. They might then challenge his authority. And in this context, I wonder if it was just impossible, that it could not be done, that there was no feasible way of conquering Scotland in the same way that Edward had conquered Wales, for instance, unless he had simply chosen to exterminate the entire Scottish political class and just wipe them all out and replace them with his own men. That might have worked, I suppose, but it's not really, it's not really very realistic. It's the sort of extreme option that wasn't really on the table. You can't just butcher everyone in sight, even in the 13th century. You can do it in the 15th century. Wars of the Roses, that's fine. You could kill anyone you like just because it was Tuesday, but this is a different era. Anyway, so that's my video on Michael Brown's article. There's probably more to say about it, but these are just some thoughts. Hope it was interesting, and I will hopefully speak to you again.